Hello, I'm Lynn Joy-Rich, Director of the LGBTQIA+ Thinking Initiative at the Pembroke Center at Brown University, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this symposium on queering pandemics / queer as pandemic. The concept for this event emerged in the spring of 2022 in interdisciplinary conversations between people interested in the LGBTQIA+ Thinking Initiative, particularly between me, Pembroke Associate Director Wendy Lee, and one of our speakers today, Sarah A. Williams, about the ways in which queer and trans communities, who of course had faced, suffered, learned, and created so much in relation to the HIV/AIDS pandemic, so how those people were responding to and engaging with COVID-19, the pandemic then very much on everyone's minds. For COVID, in some ways, both recalled and certainly posed particular challenges for those living with HIV/AIDS, and in some ways even for queer folks more broadly, given, for example, various discourses that circulated around who counted as safe or immediate circles of socialization. At that point then, we were grouping our conversations under the informal title of Queer COVID. As time and our symposium planning progressed, global and local Mpox outbreaks also began to enter the news, with reporting that a majority of cases were found in men who have sex with men. Panicked responses to Mpox even more called to mind the panic, still not over, even as it may be displaced both psychologically and geopolitically over HIV/AIDS. Simultaneously, and increasingly more and more each day it seems, various onslaughts, both rhetorical and material, over public health resources, institutions, and spokespeople, and I'd suggest not coincidentally on queer and trans people, especially as these LGBTQ+ identities and communities intersect with Black, Indigenous, and of color identities and communities, those onslaughts seem to be exploding to the point where even discussions of the histories, practices, life experiences, and care of such people have come under fierce attack, often through the rhetoric of, again, pandemics. In other words, it's now common to hear the claim that LGBTQ+ identities and identifications, practices and pleasures, subjectivities and socialities, and especially BIPOC LGBTQ+ identities and practices are out of control contagions, requiring an end to everything from medical care to dangerous library books and other communicable information, uncontained drag shows, and online viral videos. All of this made us realize that we at the initiative wanted to broaden the focus of our investigation into the dynamics and intersections of queerness in the most expansive sense and pandemics. Indeed, to explore how the dynamics and intersections are already deep, broad, multifaceted, and complex. To help us think about this, a planning group met over the fall and looked at the work of, among others, the brilliant, capacious thinkers we have here today, about whom I'll say more as we proceed. And we thus arrived at our Queering Pandemics, Queer as Pandemic topic, in which we hope to consider both the ways in which pandemics, from HIV/AIDS to COVID-19 and Mpox, have been endured, engaged, and confronted by queer and trans communities, as well as the ways in which queer and trans identifications and practices have themselves, as I said, been figured as viral, as contagious, as pandemic. Those are the questions we've posed to our wonderful speakers, Joseph Osmondson, Marlon M. Bailey, Ava Hayward, and Sarah A. Williams. And I'll be telling you more about each of them before their presentations. Before we get to that first presentation, though, just some quick thanks to those without whom this event wouldn't be possible. So I'd like to express my deep appreciation of our Pembroke director, Leela Gandhi, the Pembroke Administrative Coordinator, Diane Straker, and Pembroke Manager, Donna Goodnow, our fabulous co-sponsors, the Brown Women's Network and the LGBTQ Center, Hannah Jouedi, I'm sorry for the mispronunciation, and the team at Media Services, and the wonderful aforementioned planning committee for this event, Wendy Lee, Sarah A. Williams, Harper Shalot, and Sarah Gamble, who also both leads the Pembroke Public Health Collaborative, another of our appreciated co-sponsors, and is Pembroke Communications Manager, who designed the poster for the event. So if that slide of the poster image can be shown. As just a final image, I do want to direct your attention again to that poster image, which Sarah designed around the image, which some of you might recognize, titled Art Attack on AIDS, made by Keith Haring in 1988. Again, as many of you no doubt know, Haring was an American artist activist who used his images to advocate for, among other things, safer sex and HIV/AIDS awareness. He died on February 16, 1990 of AIDS. I suggested this image to Sarah for our poster because I find it both beautiful and uncanny, and particularly appropriate for this event, given the way in which it so clearly marks how we're connected, even porous to one another, with openings that perhaps always put us at risk of contaminations, yet that also always link us as friends, lovers, families, strugglers, coworkers, neighbors, communities. I thus think it encapsulates the notion of queering pandemics / queer as pandemics, a topic that I'm happy to explore with you and all of our panelists. So that image can come down, and let's now begin exploring that with our panelists. So our first panelist today is Joseph Osmondson, who is a scientist, writer, and activist. He has a PhD in molecular biophysics and is a clinical assistant professor of biology at NYU. Professor Osmondson's interests are far-ranging. His research on protein structure and function has been published in scientific journals such as Cell and PNAS, and his creative work on bodies, queerness, race, geography, and other topics has appeared in, among other sites, Medium, The Village Voice, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Gawker, the Kenyon Review, Lambda Literary Review, and the Feminist Wire, where he's an associate editor. His book, Virology, Essays for the Living, the Dead, and the Small Things in Between, published with Norton, is a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and Lambda Literary Award for nonfiction. He is also the author of the books Inside Out, which came out with Sibling Rivalry Press, and Capsid, a Love Story, which appeared with Indolent Books and won the POZ Award for Best HIV Writing. Commenting on Osmondson's work, Kies Lehman states, "I don't know that there is a writer in this country doing as much with queer theory, narrative momentum, whiteness, sexual identity, and the literal outside as Joseph Osmondson. Rare and deserve praise indeed." So please join me in welcoming Joe Osmondson, who will speak on Pandemic Science Needs Queer Theory, Why a Queer Science is Necessary in an Age of Pandemic.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you, Lynn, and thank you everyone on the panel and who's in the audience and who worked so hard to put this together. I'm going to start by defining a term that I'm calling pre-science. So decades of research, beginning perhaps with Latour's essential laboratory life, show that what scientists study and how we study it are social and political choices where pre-scientific meaning is made. I say pre-scientific meaning here because if one doesn't consider an experiment worth doing, science is actually a meaningless epistemology. Science never gets done. It remains questions not worthy of answering. It remains pre-science. And here's where we get into our understanding of pandemics. Science is one way of understanding a pandemic and is necessary for our survival of them. Science can answer questions about how to protect ourselves and others and develop tools that will help some people survive, like vaccines and medications that target a viral pathogen. But I want to take Mpox here as an example of pre-science. On an activist call last May, I guess now, knowing that bathhouses in Chicago and LA were not set to close, and people reported catching Mpox via surfaces in the summer of 2022, I asked one of the world's only Mpox epidemiologists, what cleaning agents render the Mpox virus non-infectious, and how should they be used? I figured we could gather this information and inform people who worked in those places how to best protect themselves and the people who gather there. But the answer, again, from one of the world's only experts on this virus, we don't actually know. Here's some more Mpox pre-science. Is the Mpox virus in semen or in vaginal fluid? What infectious dose of Mpox is required for infection? Do any human genes help determine Mpox disease severity? Does 1 or 2 doses of the Jynneos vaccine prevent infection or decrease symptoms? Does viral infection deposition on skin versus mucous membrane change the likelihood of infection or severity of disease? Does the small molecule inhibitor tecovirimat decrease duration of infection or severity of symptoms? On and on and on. Pre-science is queer. It is the knowable unknown. And much of queer and trans life is pre-science, mostly because science doesn't generally study queer and trans people. And when it does, science often does more harm than good. We scientists and those who fund our work did not deem any of the above questions worthy of study prior to the global spread of Mpox in 2022. Here in the American context, even after the global spread of this pathogen, we have seen no increase in funding to address these outstanding questions. This question of what and who we study is not new, but I want to take this as a foundation for consideration of why science alone, as an island of an epistemology, can do harm, and why science, when combined with material analysis, can lead directly to political insight. I want to be clear here that what I'm talking about is not Marx's view of politics and materialism as a science, or Nietzsche's view of philosophy as a gay science. Nietzsche and Marx are enmeshed in white Enlightenment thinking and consider science as a superior epistemology. Marx comes at a time and of a movement towards science in politics and philosophy, and even in theology. These thinkers view science as uniquely able to determine the underpinnings of the human condition. According to Nietzsche, scientific philosophy has even killed God. I'm not arguing for a scientific materialism in this way. I'm arguing that science itself is material and needs to be analyzed as such. I further argue that science without this material analysis, that science insufficiently describes the world in which we live. One cannot understand Mpox without understanding colonialism and post-colonialism. And therefore, science leaves many vulnerable people behind, what Foucault would call those whose lives are rendered by biopower, disallowed to the point of illness and death. In a sense, I am arguing that one must theorize science as a part of doing it. Science and science studies cannot be separate. Nietzsche wrote The Gay Science to argue that scientific philosophy is gay, as in enjoyable, a fun mental puzzle. I am attempting to queer science by saying that straight science, science as the sole objective epistemology, must end. So I'll argue that science alone is not only insufficient but dangerous as a sole epistemology, that we must train scientists to be aware of the social, political, and material world in which they work, and to publish these findings as a part of their work. Therefore, we must apply routinely social and political analyses to scientific results, and even to what we deem as pre-science or a lack of results. Science is an institution made of people, and it prefers to move straight ahead. To do what I suggest would be to queer science. So I want to talk briefly about a scientific misunderstanding of queer and trans identity. All the way back in 2011, deep in the push for gay marriage rights and the I Was Born This Way movement, I wrote a science studies piece critiquing this notion, focusing on the genetic research on the genetic basis of male homosexuality. There is a lot to unpack here, and I don't have time to do so sufficiently, but I just want to target some highlights in how I think science misunderstands when it attempts to be an epistemology that studies sexuality. So the argument was that legal rights are more secure for certain groups of people in the US with historically demonstrated oppression like women and Black people and Indigenous people, but to be considered for this type of strict scrutiny under the law, one must show that the oppressed category is immutable, that it is inborn and cannot be changed through personal action. So this is dubious given the poorest categories that do count already for strict scrutiny, which include religion, something that few would argue is inherently inborn. So starting in the early 1990s, researchers were attempting to show genetic underpinnings of male sexuality in order to argue that sexuality was immutable and therefore queer people deserve greater protections under the law. The scientists doing these studies were gay men themselves. In the ways that they were approaching their own sexuality, it's clear to me that they viewed their own queerness as deficiency and were using genetics to explain why anyone would be a horrible homosexual. I'm just going to read some titles from scientific articles at that time. One title is Genetic Feminization of Brain Structures and Changed Sexual Orientation in Male Drosophila. Drosophila are fruit flies. With a commentary in the same issue of Science called Bisexual Fruit Flies Point to Brain Courtship Centers. I argued in 2011 that understanding sexuality as immutable and or genetic was a double-edged sword, which could just as easily lead to the genetic treatment of queerness. Additionally, it disappeared those of us, myself included, who do feel large aspects of choice in who we desire, who we have sex with, and who we enter into romantic entanglements with. I cannot help but think about our current gay and trans moral panic here, where there's a conservative assumption that queerness and transness are spreading like a pathogen, usually to our daughters. In reality, what we've seen is queerness being treated biomedically as a pathogen to be gotten rid of. As evidence of this, in that piece in 2011, that a clear genetic basis for homosexuality could actually lead to treating queerness away, I examined a genetic difference called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH. CAH is a hormonal difference that occurs in utero, so in the womb, that causes XX children to be born, chromosomally XX children to be born with higher levels of androgen and testosterone than average. This can cause, as the literature would call it, a masculinized body, and for the child to be classified as intersex at birth. Importantly, it also leads to a significantly higher likelihood of lesbianism later in life. I'm going to read from an article by a clinician studying the genetics and treating mothers who are going to have a child with CAH. I'm quoting here, "The challenge here is to see what could be done to restore this baby to the normal female appearance, which would be compatible with her parents presenting her as a girl, with her eventually becoming somebody's wife and having normal sexual development and becoming a mother. And she has all the machinery for motherhood, and therefore nothing should stop that. If we can repair her surgically and help her psychologically to continue to grow and develop as a girl. To this end, this doctor and others routinely treated CAH with a hormone to the mother given to treat the baby in utero, giving the mother the drug such that the little girl will be born normal and will be less likely to experience lesbianism later in life." Finally, to the point of the gay male researcher desire to understand sexuality as immutable, I was once on a date with a man who said he would have given up anything to be straight. Who wants to be gay? I said, me. I love my queerness. I hadn't yet read it, but I now take Foucault's view of homosexuality not simply as a system of desire, but as something desirable, because it allows networks of friendships and intimacy, both sexual and not, that heterosexuality does not allow. I choose to be queer and leave my fucking genes out of it. In this way, I do think queerness is contagious, but that's a good thing. Queer models give young people a notion of a life outside of compulsory heterosexuality, the wife and 2.5 kids and the picket fence, that even as a kid, I think of David Wojnarowicz all the time. You grow up with this life and you're like, that's hell. I would do anything to not live like that. A life of art and of friendship and of activism and of pleasure. That notion, when visible, can be life-saving. I would have killed to have more visible queerness for myself as a child. I want to move on to a second part where I talk about how science does harm, direct harm in understanding the emergence of pathogens, namely HIV and Mpox. So I'm going to actually, see if I can do it. I'm going to pull up a figure, and I think y'all can see it now. This is a figure from a science paper on the molecular epidemiology of HIV's global transmission. HIV essentially moving from a local virus, largely in what was then the Belgian Congo, to a global pandemic. And while this is one of my fields, I'm not going to talk too much about how these data were developed. But what they show, so viruses like living organisms essentially write themselves down in a genetic code. That genetic code can trace a history. And if one has old samples, one can build maps and timelines of global spread worldwide, which we actually have seen with SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID. You can trace the geography and timing of the emergence of the virus. But when I see a figure like this, I immediately think, what is the geopolitical context, right? So here we have a figure that shows geographies. It shows movement of a viral pathogen, in this case HIV, from Congo to Haiti to New York, and from New York to the rest of the world, and it has dates associated with these movements. And my immediate question that is not addressed in the scientific literature is, what is happening between the Congo, Haiti, and the US at the time? So I want to add to this history of HIV by talking about HIV's emergence in a region of Central Africa between contemporary Cameroon and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where a closely related family of viruses, the SIV viruses, are commonly found in chimpanzees, macaques, and around a dozen other species of non-human primates. We know incontrovertibly from these genetic analyses that HIV emerges from animals into humans likely dozens of times, certainly many more times than once. Most of these zoonoses, as we call them, transmission from animals into humans, were self-limiting, did not spread globally. Sometime between 1900 and 1940, the HIV-1M clade, the family of viruses that first did spread globally, begins its consistent human-to-human transmission. And this occurs not in Cameroon, where the SIV viruses are, but hundreds of miles south in Kinshasa in the Congo. The best hypothesis for understanding how HIV moves from a rare and rural human virus into a global epidemic involves colonial medical outposts, reusing needles, and cities like Kinshasa that grew from small towns of fewer than 10,000 people to large urban megacities with hundreds of thousands of people, many displaced from their homes by urban colonization in a period of just decades. The work that I'm presenting here is an ongoing collaboration between myself and my friend, Gofen Mabutubwele, who's a Congolese lawyer and human rights expert, knowledgeable on the geopolitical history of the Congo at the time. In 1960, a decade before HIV travels from the Congo to Haiti and from Haiti to New York. At 1960, at liberation, Congo had exactly 0 doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, or professors. 16 Congolese people out of 9 million had college degrees, all obtained outside the country. HIV had been spreading for decades in a country with, under Belgian rule, 9 million people and 900 doctors. This number went down to 200 doctors as most white people fled the newly freed Congolese state. The Belgians wrote in articles calling 200 doctors a crisis, a reason to reinstate Belgian colonial rule, but viewed the previous state of 900 doctors as their rule under their rule as sufficient. Due to the utter lack of a professional class in the new Belgian state, the UN wrote a charter to fund Haitian professionals, Black and Francophone, to come to the Congo and be its first generation of doctors, lawyers, teachers, and professors. Between 1960 and 1965, around 7,500 Haitians travel to and from the Congo. It is via this travel that HIV arrives in Haiti in the mid-1960s and then spreads to New York around 1970, where it again spreads for over a decade in queer sexual networks before being identified as the viral cause of GRID, what we were calling it at the time, the gay-related immunodeficiency. And remember the 4 H's of the early HIV crisis: homosexuals, Haitians, hemophiliacs, and heroin or injection drug users, all incredibly marginalized communities at that time. I want to use the term biopower as elaborated by Foucault. And as I'm defining biopower here, it is policies enacted by the state or its superstructures that either foster life or disallow life to the point of death. Colonization is an extreme form of biopower, and the Belgian Congo was an extreme form of colonization. 900 doctors, all white, for 9 million people is disallowing life to the point of death. It's no wonder that HIV spread through the Congo for decades without ever being recognized. Infectious diseases like HIV show us how African lives, as my friend Goffin reminds us, are not disconnected from other lives. Disallowing lives to the point of death anywhere is disallowing all life, as lives are connected by trade, travel, language, touch, sex and sexuality, family, etc., 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 including along direct lines from Kinshasa to Haiti to New York and San Francisco and Brazil and Thailand, etc., etc., etc. If we go back to this figure on the science of HIV evolution and its geographical distribution, I argue strongly that we cannot understand this figure without understanding the political and cultural context. This figure on its own is a half-truth to the point where it's almost harmful outside of the knowledge of colonial and post-colonial violence. But combining these epistemologies into what I'm calling a queer science is dangerous to the status quo. The queer science here points to colonial death-making and violence. The science and material analysis overlapped cannot but lead to an explicitly anti-colonial and anti-post-colonial and anti-capitalist position. One cannot neglect the health of others anywhere on this planet. The choices made to refuse sufficient medical infrastructure in the Congo led directly to HIV as a global epidemic, and the patterns of migration set up to alleviate some of that colonial violence were the exact lines on which the epidemic spread. This past summer, a new global viral threat emerged. I want to emphasize the word global here because this new virus, Mpox, had been causing illness and death in Central and West Africa for decades. Mpox is a DNA virus similar to smallpox. It causes a flu-like illness and a skin rash and can be deadly in pregnant people and children and those with compromised immune systems, including people with untreated HIV. Scientists first described Mpox in humans in the rural Congo in 1970, where it has reservoirs in several rodent species. Through the 1980s, Mpox was rare, and its outbreaks were largely self-limiting. People would get sick, and a few more people within a house usually would get sick, and then the epidemic would die out of its own volition. The vaccine that protects against smallpox also protects against Mpox. Through 1980, when Mpox outbreaks were self-limiting, nearly 90% of people in the Congo had immunity against both smallpox and mpox due to WHO vaccination campaigns. But when the WHO announces that smallpox is eradicated from the planet in 1980, they stopped vaccinating. Therefore, immunity fell to less than 20% of the population of the DRC by 2010. Consequently, as smallpox and monkeypox immunity is waning, mpox becomes much more common and geographically distributed, and it has longer and longer epidemics with more and more people in a single chain of epidemics falling ill. Again, even though it was easily preventable by a high quality and safe vaccine. In 2016, the US government let millions of doses of smallpox vaccine expire in freezers rather than administer them to people at risk of mpox. 1 year later, in 2017, an outbreak of mpox in Nigeria began that continues to this day. It was this outbreak eventually that spread via queer social and sexual networks globally, infecting at least 85,000 people as of early 2023 and killing 80 people. Remember, all that mpox pre-science. Is mpox in semen or vaginal fluid? What infectious dose of the virus is required for infection, etc., etc., etc. We chose not to study these questions because mpox was then just infecting Black people in Africa. Again, here, the science and materialist analysis overlapped cannot but lead to an explicitly anti-colonial, anti-post-colonial, and anti-capitalist position. One cannot neglect the health and science of others on this planet. The choices made to refuse sufficient medical infrastructure in the Congo led now to 2 global epidemics, both HIV and mpox. Research priorities, including neglecting research on viruses like HIV and mpox until they go global, continue to be murderous for much of the planet. The science alone shows only patterns of viral movement. The material analysis alone would posit some role of colonialism in viral spread, but together they can directly demonstrate the role of biopower in neglecting human life and give us path towards a more liberatory science for this warming planet. In conclusion, I've shown, I hope, how science alone misunderstands complex identities like sexuality and how this can do harm. I've also demonstrated, I hope, how science is examined outside of political and historical context, and that this truncates its meaning and power. It is my strong belief that science itself must be grounded in materialism in order to become not just a tool of capitalism, but a liberatory practice. This would require a revolution in how scientists are trained to do our work. We must build in this way not a gay science, but a queer science, a science grounded in the material conditions of life. Maintaining the mythology of science as objective and not a materially connected social and political project only serves the ongoing status quo, where science can just as easily be used as a tool of fascism, mass death, profit generation, and eugenics than as a tool of community care, health, and human connection. The good, bad news is that on a warming planet covered in pathogens and potential pathogens, as we face a fascist swell in global politics and a queer and trans moral panic, nothing but this revolution will save us now, and it is our work to do it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was really interesting, really fascinating and important work. So thank you. Next up, we have Marlon M. Bailey, who is professor of African and African American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Professor Bailey has also served as the Benedict Distinguished Visiting Professor in Africana Studies at Carleton College, the Distinguished Weinberg Fellow in the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern University, and visiting professor at the Center for AIDS Prevention Studies in the Department of Medicine at University of California, San Francisco. His work in critical performance ethnography and in Black LGBTQ cultural formations, sexual health, and HIV/AIDS prevention has won a number of awards, including the 2021 Achievement Award from the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association and the Alan Bray Memorial Book Prize from the GLQ Caucus of the Modern Language Association. His book, Butch Queens Up in Pumps, Gender, Performance, and Ballroom Culture in Detroit, published by the University of Michigan Press, was also a finalist for the Lambda Literary Book Award in LGBT Studies. Additionally, he is published in the Architecture Review, American Quarterly, GLQ, Signs, Feminist Studies, Souls, Gender, Place, and Culture, the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Social Services, QED, AIDS Patient Care and STDs, LGB Health, and more. And on top of all that, he's also a performing artist. Today, Professor Bailey will be speaking on Black queerness and the cruel irony of the COVID-19 pandemic 2.0.
Thank you, Lynn, for that great introduction. And I am honored to follow Joseph's talk, which we are speaking in a similar language. I think we're in good conversation. So this panel was put together well. And thank you for allowing me to participate in this very important and timely conversation. And I thank Lynn, Diane, the staff at the Pembroke Center, the planning and working groups, and the co-sponsors at Brown University for organizing this event. And I thank my fellow panelists. Thank you for the introductory remarks to this conversation. And those of you who know my work, and if you don't, I come to my work as an ethnographer, but also from a very personal relationship to my work and being a member of the Black LGBTQIA+ community. And I often am very vulnerable around how issues that I examine impact my own life as well as how it impacts others. Preparing my remarks for this conversation allowed me to look backward and inward to the conditions I was living under and my state of mind when I wrote this essay and its subsequent publication in QED in 2020 during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic and before the rollout of the vaccines. Of note, I served on the Black African American expert panel for the NIH and the Vaccine Trial Network. And this panel reviewed the protocols, most of the protocols for the COVID-19 vaccine. So this essay turned into an opportunity to get into my head in order to get out of it, if that makes sense, and to re-examine Black queer communities and COVID through a lens, using the concept through this lens I refer to as the cruel irony, which emerged because of this looking inward to look outward. So in this paper, I highlight the lessons I have learned since the 2020 essay on the cruel irony of the COVID-19 pandemic for Black queer people, reflecting on the challenges that it presented for my HIV prevention research with the ballroom community, which I'll talk about in a little bit as a part of this talk, my friendships, and my mental health and well-being. Thus, Black queerness and the cruel irony of the COVID-19 pandemic 2.0 is a revisitation of a meditation on this concept of cruel irony to attend to the occasion during multiple pandemics of a variety of types, i.e. viral, social, political, economic, and more. One day in May of 2020, my current situation. It is another Friday morning in May at 6 a.m. I reach down between my legs and feel my intense erection and realize why I woke up so abruptly. It is another day of being self-quarantined in my house in Indianapolis for the past 3 months. When I arise, as I typically do, I reach for my glasses to look at my phone. I wonder if I received any text messages last night after I fell asleep. Indeed, I did, from my best friend who is 3 hours behind me. I love you, man. I immediately feel warmth literally running through my chest. During the early part of the pandemic, we promised each other that we would check in on each other and give reminders either through text, phone, or video chat of how much we value and love each other. Before the pandemic, while I was in Arizona, we would do this often, and these check-ins were mostly in person. Still, the text message from my best friend is enough to get me out of bed and motivate me to embark upon my usually busy day of meetings, reading, and writing. During the COVID-19 pandemic, for some Black queer individuals like me, technology has become the primary and sometimes the only way to stay in connection to loved ones. However, at this very moment, though, I'm horny as fuck, I'm tired of jacking off, I have neither had sex nor my body touched in 3 months, mainly due to my fear of possibly exposing myself to COVID-19. I hear a message notification from the Blackade sex app on my phone. I see that I have a few messages, as I normally do, from attractive brothers asking me if I want to link up for some fun. I usually respond to get to know them better and see what they are into, but eventually, when he asks me if I want to come through or can I host, I back out and stop responding. I want to do it, but then again, I don't. Some other men that I meet on the apps want to come over to my place and link up. And when I ask them their COVID status, they either say they don't know or they are negative. Gay apps like Adam for Adam started including COVID-19 status, and men would provide their COVID status and their most recent test results. Because I don't know these men, I cannot bring myself to link up with them because they may have the Rona and not know it and blow it in my face while we're doing it. When I asked the guy, would he be willing to wear a mask? He said, quote, "Hell no, that's weird," end of quote. Ironically, I do not normally ask for HIV status. Prior to the pandemic, I did not normally ask for HIV status of men that I meet online because my risk reductive approaches are typically to only fuck raw with my regulars, my friends with benefits with whom I have been having sex for many years. And while not foolproof, I know more about their HIV and STD and STI status and their sex partners and practices than I would know from someone random. I deploy risk reductive strategies by only having oral sex and jacking off and using condoms or refraining from busting nuts inside each other with those with whom I do not have a fuckship or what we call a situationship. But although I am battling mild depression due to a combination of loneliness, sadness, and fear about my current situation, I remind myself daily of the many virtues in my life. I'm lucky. I own a beautiful home in downtown Indianapolis. I am a tenured university professor. I have a guaranteed job, at least for as long as a job can be guaranteed in the US Academy. And I am healthy. I have good health insurance, and I'm financially stable. This is not the case for the larger communities within which I am situated. Community conditions, 2020 and beyond. The COVID-19 pandemic has hold on one second. The COVID-19 pandemic has created a paradoxical consequences and conditions for Black queer people and other queers of color. The pandemic has exposed the social and health disparities that disproportionately impact LGBTQ people of color, and these inequities were exacerbated by COVID-19. According to a 2020 study conducted by the Williams Institute, LGBTQ plus people of color were nearly twice as likely to experience the health and economic impacts of COVID-19 than both white LGBTQ people and non-LGBTQ white people. This was the case even though, as the Williams Institute observed, that LGBTQ people of color were also more likely to follow public health measures, such as getting tested for COVID-19, social distancing, and wearing masks than non-LGBTQ white people. The pandemic made more severe mental health crises and mental health disparities already existing for LGBTQ people of color. Among the Human Rights Commission's report in 2021 called The State of Mental Health in LGBTQ Communities of Color, over a majority, 54% of LGBTQ adults of color are battling poor mental health today. Transgender adults of color are even more likely, 61%, to face these struggles in their daily lives. And despite high rates of poor mental health, only 29% of LGBTQ adults of color say they have been diagnosed with a depressive order from a provider, compared to 39% of the LGBTQ adults broadly. Specifically for Black LGBTQ people, the Williams Institute found that out of the 1.2 million Black LGBTQ people in the US, 25% have been diagnosed with depression. Of note, according to research from the Center for American Progress, people of color systemically receive inadequate health care, which may explain why too few LGBTQ people of color receive diagnosis and the care they need. And adding to the mix of how LGBT communities of color, particularly Black queer people, are disproportionately impacted directly and indirectly by the HIV/AIDS epidemic, these inequities are what it means to live in the United States for Black, Brown, Native, and Indigenous American communities. If one's experiences exist at the intersections of race, class, gender, and sexual oppression, it can seem rather dystopic. This multi-pronged crises of COVID-19, socioeconomic collapse, white supremacy, and virulent anti-Black racism, structural homophobia, and transphobia have exposed the myth of an American multiracial egalitarian society. This moment makes crystal clear the deleterious wages of racial capitalism and crises, and the ways that the state will distract and mobilize violence, the police, for example, to quell dissent and suppress resistance to these conditions. We can point to that even today, given the occurrence that happened yesterday in the Tennessee legislature, where they expelled 2 Black state legislators for protesting police violence, gun violence, I'm sorry. Yet, also part of this health crisis are the workings and consequences of structural homophobia and transphobia. These consequences are clear for those of us who, like me, reject heteronormative family forms, and those of us who have been rejected by these forms. During an infectious viral pandemic that thrives on and because of structural inequalities, Black queers, for example, like me, have been quarantined from the very social, interpersonal, and communal practices and structures that sustain us through a public health crisis. It is a cruel irony. Unpacking the cruel irony. So I'm a people person. I write, work, live among communities. I enjoy my space and my alone time, but I always look forward to having dinner, drinks, or just hanging out with friends who have been my actual family. I've never viewed my family of origin as family. I have written elsewhere that family is not about being, rather, it is about doing and becoming. Now, however, I go weeks without any physical or in-person contact or connection with another human being. This was during the pandemic, during my quarantining. Unable to touch, hug, kiss, cuddle, lean on, and put my arms around my friends who are not only my friends, but also my main reason for living hurts so much. I am afraid. I don't want to get sick. I don't want to get COVID-19. I don't want to die before I get to see and be with my loved ones again. The loneliness I feel and the deprivation from physical touch and intimacy are a daily struggle. What is ironic, though, is how quarantining created the opportunity for me to experience greater emotional intimacy with myself and sometimes other Black men. Having to shelter in place and be alone in my home day in and day out, except for occasional walks to the stores in my neighborhood, has forced me to delve deep into my emotional life in ways that I haven't seen since my professional acting days. In addition, these conditions have allowed me to listen to my inner self, the aspect of myself that I have been neglecting for a long time. COVID-19 has forced me to sit, be with myself, and contemplate pleasure and joy beyond the physical and sexual contact. Now, throughout my scholar, artist, activist career, I have always been interested in how my work informs my life and how my life informs my work. Although heretofore in my research and writing, I have mostly emphasized the physical and sexual dimension of deep intimacy, and the COVID-19 pandemic has forced me to think differently. Now, I want to understand the emotional dimensions of intimacy with myself and others. Deep intimacy, this concept that I'm working with in my current book project, is about deep intimacy with myself and what it means to delve deep into my emotions and explore my pain and pleasures, asking myself, what do I want? What makes me feel good about myself? And what makes me feel afraid? These are also questions that I ask my interlocutors in my current research project on the impact of the HIV/AIDS epidemic on Black and men's sexuality. So deep intimacy with others is about a mutual emotional, sometimes physical, but not necessarily sexual connection with others. It is also about a mutual willingness to embark upon the difficult work of becoming emotionally vulnerable. What I have learned from myself and from the research that I have conducted with Black men, gay, straight, and non-gay identified, is that we need and long for emotional intimacy, but we often lack the willingness, courage, tools, and often the conditions to forge these kinds of relationships. Like HIV/AIDS, COVID-19 is disproportionately detrimental to the overall health and well-being of Black gay men. Yet the discourses and practices of prevention, safety, and risk and harm reduction create the opportunity for Black gay men and others to think about and engage our lives more holistically, as opposed to reducing our existence to sex. Now, don't get me wrong. Sex is an essential aspect of most of our lives, no more or less than any other sexual beings. But for Black gay men, the actual intersecting identities are thought to be the complete truth of who we are, which forecloses on the possibilities of who we individually can be and what kind of relationships and connections we can and are allowed to forge. This is similar to what Joseph was talking about in his previous presentation. So my intimate friendships have become extremely important to me lately. I became interested in friendship as a theoretical concept and analytic when I was introduced to an interview with Michel Foucault entitled Friendship as a Way of Life. In this interview, Foucault offers a theory of same-gender friendship, both men and women, as a queer way of life. It is not necessarily a friendship rooted in or forged through our sexual identities. Rather, Foucault contemplates what friendship can offer for deeper human connection and intimacy. In true Foucauldian form, he first reminds us that we should resist the temptation to root our desires and identities and view sexuality as the truth of who we are, which dictates what we can be, what we can and should do, and with whom. Here and elsewhere, Foucault argues that we should be skeptical of linking the goal of liberating desires to the claiming of a sexual identity. Institutionalized and state-recognized identities delimit the experiences and connections one can have. Instead, Foucault suggests that we think of friendship as an expansive, multidimensional relationship form through which we can give and receive pleasure and joy that is not necessarily sexual, but erotic, sensual, emotional, and intimate. Thus, what do pandemics like HIV and the COVID-19 force us to do? Or in the case of COVID-19, how do the conditions of quarantining alone require one to examine one's relationship to oneself and others? In my case, at the time, my friendship with my straight male friend had come into focus and become a way for me to confront many emotional roadblocks and vulnerabilities, hopefully as a source of healing. A deeply intimate friendship between Black men across sexual difference can be an important source of mutual healing and survival during a pandemic that requires sheltering in place, social distancing, and facial coverings as a way of life. However, to add further irony, the 17-year friendship that I discussed here, and which prompted this reflection, ended in 2021. As life would have it, it was the quarantining during the pandemic, the writing of this essay and others, the work that I have been doing with my therapist and the friendships that I have developed with others that helped me get through this very difficult moment. This experience contributed to me beginning the journey of embracing the traumatized Black queer child in me. And I am starting to nurture him and thus develop a more healthy friendship with myself. Prior to this, I hadn't taken the time to develop a relationship with the inner Marlon child who now realized that I grew up without feeling emotionally safe in my family and community of origin, which contributed to me participating in relationships in my adulthood that compromise and undermine and violate my emotional safety. At this COVID-19 pandemic moment, one in which the over a million deaths and the social, economic, and health crises have fallen out of the media focus, people are still getting COVID, some dying from it, albeit fewer, and the failures of our dysfunctional and privatized healthcare system are brought into focus again now as it relates to reproductive and gender affirming care. And like the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the United States, I continue to grapple with several questions. What does it mean to keep myself emotionally safe while pursuing deeper, intimate connections with a range of Black men and gender expansive people of color, now that in some ways it seems that life is getting back to quote unquote normal? But what does that mean for Black queer people? What is deep intimacy, and what does this have to do with Black joy? The COVID-19 pandemic was a horrific experience. Looking back on it, I am not sure how I got through it. I experienced a lot of loss, the loss of loved ones who transitioned and the loss of friendships. And like many others, I experienced the rage around the George Floyd murder by police and was deeply disheartened by the failed response to it by my university. My university then, not the current one. And so what is cruelly ironic, though, is that the pandemic forced me to and created the conditions for me to grapple with critical questions that I only started thinking about in the way that I have presented them here today. During the COVID-19 pandemic, while in isolation, sitting with and by myself, I only started thinking about these questions in the way that I have presented here during the COVID-19 pandemic, while in isolation, sitting with and by myself. And like my fellow colleagues point out, this cruel irony is a queer one. That is to say, a way of looking at the world in crises and how that view of the world in crises produce produces different opportunities and pushes us to become different people, hopefully for the better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marlon, for such a thoughtful, moving paper. Thank you. Next, we have Ava Hayward, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies at Utrecht University. And so we're particularly appreciative that she could join us with the large time difference. Professor Hayward has also taught at the University of Arizona and the University of New Mexico. A Fulbright scholar in Austria, she's also held postdoctoral fellowships at Duke University and at Uppsala University in Sweden. Her research focuses on ecology, art, and trans studies, and she has published in several journals and books, including, among others, Anglo-Aki Journal of Theoretical Humanities, Ozone, a journal of object-oriented studies, Parallax, Differences, Cultural Anthropology, Women in Performance, Women's Studies Quarterly, GLQ, the Transgender Studies Reader 2, Queering the Non-Human, and she also co-edited the important Trans in a Time of HIV/AIDS issue of TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. Esther Ensmere of Uppsala University said of her work, Hayward has helped to develop new ground for transdisciplinary work, mixing art and visual representation with zoology and feminist technoscience studies. And we'll get a taste of Professor Hayward's innovative intermixtures in her presentation today entitled Unbecoming.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to try to share my slides. Great. I would like to thank the organizers for including me on this panel and making it possible for me to be with you from across the ocean and into the night. I look forward to thinking and talking with you, my fellow panelists, and you, the audience listening today. I want to also acknowledge that today would be my mother's 65th birthday. Last year, as COVID restrictions lifted and many in the US had vaccines, my mother took her life. She didn't die of COVID, or did she? Her death makes me wonder if we even know what a pandemic is, how emergencies produce shallow answers to bad questions, and how the language of medicine and science assure our adumbrations. Pandemics have left us all with so much loss and equally with so many unanswered and perhaps unanswerable questions. Hopefully, my talk can participate in inviting us to question what we think we already know about pandemics. I need to say that this paper is very much a work in progress. What I thought I would share with you today, I decided not to because this event is recorded. There are unbecoming things, personal things that I would like to say about dying, about AIDS, about gender dysphoria that are too dangerous to say on a recording that might circulate. As some of you may well know, recorded events like these have a way of making a trans woman's life even more precarious. So rather than give you an auto-poetic and psychoanalytic study of Giancarlo Pastore's 2003 Italian novel, Jellyfish, a novel that figures sexuality and death together through the dematerialization of its protagonist, he becomes jellyfish-like, and in which doctor examinations are interwoven with fisting porn, I will regrettably give you an unfinished talk, a talk not yet together, pieces coming not together but apart. But perhaps this is also a useful place to start to think about pandemics, not for stylish reasons, though you might find it so. It is for reasons associated with academic life in the ongoingness of COVID, academic life in the ongoingness of AIDS, academic life in the ongoingness of trans misogyny. Surely it too, everywhere, is a social illness. About trans misogyny, I have described elsewhere as a confusion of trans and misogyny. Trans misogyny is not the hatred of trans plus the hatred of women. What is trans misogyny is a social disfiguration that takes as its example trans women. Trans misogyny is a dimension of misogyny, not supplemental, but a structure of hate at the center of racialized misogyny. What is trans misogyny is prior to misogyny, in that it exposes the securitization of race at work in the hatred of women. You cannot think one without the other, and in this order. There is no misogyny without trans misogyny, because misogyny is racialized violence. As such, there is no dysphoria without trans misogyny, which also means dysphoria is racialized. This is not solidarity thinking, this is reason. Trans misogyny is also a hate directed at a feminine pleasure for herself. She indulges in an aesthetic of her own, entering a social order on her wanton terms. The cost is high, often deadly. The social has its racial and sexual aesthetic orders. With all its force, it aims at her audacity. It aims at her. Her embodiment, at least partly, is for her pleasure, even if her body also exceeds her intentions. But the social dements and mutilates around her want. With every cut she makes, domination reveals its authority. Inevitably, or at least for now, power conscribes her want into its own and at her expense. I will say a little more about these ideas later, but for now, this talk is nearby these ongoings: AIDS, COVID, transmisogyny, which are only a few of the ongoings happening for those of you listening. You too, I imagine, have so much going on, so much that my talk will fail to address, that leave our lives, academic and otherwise, unfinished, apart, not together, especially when we most yearn for togetherness in writing, in teaching, in our everyday lives. It is this context that has me thinking of the ongoingness of not here. That is not what is co-here, what as in coherent, here together, but what is not here, what cannot come together, cannot cohere. It is in this spirit that I offer you this incoherent paper, this rather unbecoming talk. The organizers gave us a series of provocations to consider how pandemics have impacted queer trans communities and how queerness and transness are figured as pandemics, as social plagues, if you will. The first thought I had when reading was a refusal to even entertain the representation that trans people, that trans women are a plague, a social disease. I would encourage the trans women listening to me speak to disidentify with this line of thinking. Even the white liberals, our so-called feminist sisters, will want you to identify with your own self-loathing. It is easier to get rid of you that way. The plague, of course, is non-transness. That is to say, You might think the scar under her breast or the one hidden in her hairline is gender's disaster, or what frightens you, or even what lures you. But I entreat you, look at the gnarled scarring of the Frankenstein monster that is happily a non-trans him. His gender mutilates his sexuality in the name of social order. With abandon, he butchers his embodiment in the service of comfortable meaning. With no scream, he rips up his torso, face, and hands, suturing gender as sexed coherence over what is missing, what has been forfeited, sexuality, libidinal and unconscious. It is true the trans woman's scars evidence that she, not unlike him, lives in gender's fallout. It is a catastrophe that none of us escape. But unlike him, her want is sustained, a magnetic scintilla. What is most remarkable about her is not her gender, but her want, her desire. After all, what is transmisogyny, that pandemic that we are all living in, but an envious fury, a non-transsexual rage aimed at her want? Is there anything more irreverent than wanting sex otherwise, to be loved and fucked through desire rather than comfortable social obedience? A second thought that came to mind, thinking about the organizers' provocations, was all the videoless boxes I taught to during the COVID pandemic. All the cameras off, especially for my trans students. COVID teaching for many of us educators, whether we know it or not, was an encounter with dysphoria. About dysphoria, I have written elsewhere. The burden of dysphoria is that aesthetic force of transmisogyny overwhelms reality. Another more potent and real reality engulfs her world. A vividly excoriating psychical reality supplants what is shared, making the grammar of shareability paradoxical, nonsensical, and strained to the point of nullification. Materiality and discursivity are rendered dimensional, as if parallel dimensions exist within one another. The dysphoric is multidimensional because transmisogyny is not the hatred of women, generic, deracinated category, plus trans. Transmisogyny is abjection at her not being woman, and yet her still wanting what is supposed to be foreclosed. Euphoria is not the opposite of dysphoria. Dysphoria is the wanting within inside, the foreclosure that is transmisogyny. The dysphoric knows to the point of being the excruciating violence of this caesura. We can talk more about dysphoria and transmisogyny as illnesses of the social that impinge upon the organismic, the material, the embodied during the Q&A. Now, staying with my talk in pieces, turning from these reflections on transness and sociality and how social domination is a plague to transness, I want to reflect rather carefully about the relationship between AIDS, COVID, monkeypox, and trans women. It's, as a quick note, I would say here in the Netherlands, where I recently moved a year ago, as a trans woman, I was prioritized in the Netherlands for getting a vaccine for monkeypox, while trans men were not. I say this because we think we know what a shared trans identity is, but it cannot hide how social domination enforces our differences, often beyond our control. But firstly, to go back to this second set of considerations, I would caution us all today to rethink our easy associations with AIDS, for instance, with queer and trans sexual lives. These associations are not just a historical archive, a simple remembering that gay men and trans women are disproportionately killed by AIDS. These associations, these remembrances are also forms of social domination. And here my thinking is indebted to the important work of Adam Geary and his work on anti-Black racism and AIDS. What Geary shows us is that homophobia, and I would add transphobia, shaped these so-called remembrances to obscure racisms, particularly to obscure the disproportionate effect AIDS continues to have on Black women, Black heterosexual women, and Black girls in the global South. And here I'm thinking of the work by Kathy Cohen, Julia Jordan Zachary, Celeste Watkins Hayes, that complicate and challenge the, quote, queer paradigm, end quote, as Cindy Patton called it, of the AIDS pandemic. I say this because events like today's can rehearse, if we are not careful, what Geary calls a screen discourse, where LGBTQ phobic thinking links pandemics to the imagined sexual decadence of this demographic so as to hide sexist, racist, and national logics of pandemic discourses. So with this in mind, I now turn to other reflections I have on the second part of the organizers' provocations about queering pandemics. The second set of insights is informed by the research and thinking involved in a recent special issue on HIV/AIDS of Transgender Studies Quarterly, written, edited with Che Gossett at the start of the COVID pandemic. It's quite strange to be putting this special issue together at the very moment we were put into lockdown. And that special issue carries the reactivated intensity, affective intensity of that moment for many of the contributors, but also for us as editors. With Che, we considered how the AIDS pandemic defined the field of transgender studies, which symptomatically, we argued, disavowed the centrality of AIDS for the field, as well as for the lived realities of trans women, particularly Black trans women and trans women of color. In other words, how did AIDS define the institutionalization of trans studies, this academic formation, but received so little attention in how the pandemic shaped its ideas and erasures? To situate these insights, we wrote then, Jared Sexton wrote of the fated entanglement of anti-Blackness and AIDS when he said, quote, "The fate of AIDS and the fate of the Black are fundamentally intertwined," end quote. This entanglement, Che and I argued, is an extension of what Saidiya Hartman reveals in her work as the entanglement of slavery and freedom. Freedom, then, is property in the sense of the carceral and the anti-Black metaphysics of possessive individualism, and property is freedom in the sense of life as economized by the valuations of racial capitalism, as demonstrated by the politics of AIDS and COVID-19 and big pharma. Post-AIDS ideology, which figures AIDS as over and HIV as manageable and livable, performs an anti-Black epistemic erasure of how both HIV and AIDS are necropolitical in the contemporary. The ongoing global criminalization of HIV is a death sentence for Black queer, trans, or sex workers, AIDS activists, end quote. Rather than foreclosing of AIDS as somehow over, instead, we wanted to open out onto pressing questions posed by the proximity of and the frictions between queerness, Blackness, transness, and disability. Connecting these insights back to the question of field formation, to the field formation of trans studies and institutionality, we also said there is a presumption, and this is a direct critique of Jasbir Puar and David Eng's introduction to their special issue of social text, Left of Queer. There is a presumption that AIDS in the US has gone, that we live in the afterwards of AIDS. This is simply wrong. What our special issue was meant to foreplace is that AIDS thinking continues to function as a material and political process in administrating identitarian and epistemological racial and sexual orders in the contemporary. For instance, we asked how the emergence of US-centered trans studies in the 90s, at the height of the AIDS epidemic, was shaped by the trauma of that moment. One theme we considered is how engagements with gender transgression in queer theory, that difficult twin of trans studies, as Susan Stryker once noted, promoted an anti-libidinal structure that turned gender identity into sexuality itself. As much as sexed essentialism seemed the target of gender transgression, the unconsciousness of that maneuver was sexually repressive. Perhaps, we wondered, an effect of the collapsing of anti-Black and homophobic, transphobic violence of the AIDS pandemic. There's more to be said about these insights by Gossett and myself, and I'm happy to discuss them also during the Q&A. But to summarize this last point, we may want to rephrase the question about queering the pandemic, which presumes that disease, illness impacts coherent trans and queer identities, communities, but rather, I would argue, the effects of pandemic discourses shape and define these coherences. What is coherent about identity? What is understandable about community? So when we talk about queering the pandemic, we may be misunderstanding that the very logic of that gerund, queering, that anthemeria, which is a rhetorical device for turning nouns into verbs, or maybe in this case, an adjective into a verb, that conceptual technology called queering itself may be pandemic thinking. So I will leave these points for us to discuss later. If we still have a bit more time, I'm going to finish out with one final section. To open out my concluding thoughts to more unbecoming, I want to pose another set of questions that are on my mind today. Questions about how pandemic discourse, that is the idea of AIDS itself, administrates against sexuality, works to repress sexuality, what Che and I referred to as erotophobia. Often this repressive function of AIDS discourse, for instance, is figured through death and through dying. That is, you will die of AIDS. For a young sissy like me coming into my sexuality in the 1990s, this correlation was profound. Perhaps in the contemporary with PrEP, the presence of death is differently figured, but not altogether gone. So just as the erotophobic structure of AIDS discourse screens structural inequality and violence, the necro-rhetorics of AIDS discourse displaces death onto those who can be killed, onto those already dead. In other words, some must die, says AIDS discourse, so that life can be lived well by the socially chosen. In doing so, the necro-rhetorics of AIDS hides dying processes of death inside the optimization of life. Beyond the problematics and the problem of thinking transness, queerness, and pandemics, of thinking through identity and disease, I wonder how both disease discourse and identity discourse are defenses against us thinking seriously and with attention to the dying planet we live on about death and sexuality as undomesticated, unsymbolizable forces, not bound to objects and beyond the purview of the ego, a figure of death and sexuality as precisely drive in Sigmund Freud's sense. According to Freud, the death drive is a thing beyond representation, something that pertains to primary processes, alone and typically remains unconscious, silent, undetectable, except when directed outward in the form of aggression. Like Freud's sexual drive, which demonstrates the radical irrelevance of gender, sexual identity, or anatomy to sexuality. As such, the death drive aims toward our own inorganicism. The death drive is the last avatar of sexuality, that agent of unbinding negativity, unconsciousness, and resistance to the coherence of the ego, which was the very cornerstone and the discovery of psychoanalysis. Paradoxically, pandemic discourses, maybe especially those in the context of transness and queerness, rehearse the living of some against the dying of others, the killability of the already dead or deserving of social punishment in the service of power and domination. That is, how we think about pandemics is an effort to optimize living and dying, but also within normative social constraints. So to end, my last line, so to end, perhaps, and I say this somewhat tentatively, what is needed in thinking about AIDS, COVID, monkeypox, and the next pandemic is something more radical than contextualization through and by our current sexual identities, something more radical than male, female, hetero, homo, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, transgender, and queer. We may need something more radical than this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ava, for such a beautiful and really moving presentation that asked really important questions that we need to consider. So that was really helpful and wonderful. Thank you. And now our last panelist, last but certainly not least, we have Sarah A. Williams, who is currently the Louise Lamphere Visiting Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Gender Studies here at Brown University. She will soon be starting as an assistant professor of medical anthropology at the University of Connecticut. Williams' scholarship is focused on the relationship between nationalism, racialization, gender, and health. Her book manuscript, entitled Always Already Vanishing, examines the effects that global health initiatives and domestic health laws have had on the lived experiences of Yucatec Maya women and the midwives in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Williams is currently the co-investigator and qualitative research lead on the Queer COVID Toronto project, which is examining the impact of the pandemic and public health policy and queer people's mental and physical health. She is also the author of several publications in such journals as, among others, Social Science and Medicine, American Journal of Human Biology, The Gerontologist, Women in Birth, Anthropology and Medicine, and the American Journal of Biological Anthropology. At Brown, Professor Williams is wrapping up teaching an undergraduate course on reproductive justice that includes doula training as a lab section, an offering that's been enormously popular. Her presentation today is entitled, "As Long as I'm Not Eating My Dead Husband's Ashes, I'm Good, Mental Health, Social Supports, and Queer Resiliency During the COVID-19 Pandemic."
Thank you so much for that introduction, Lynn. It's an honor to have the opportunity to think with and be in conversation with Marlon, Ava, and Joe. Let me just... Since the early days of the pandemic, queer scholars have expressed concern about the implications of the COVID pandemic and the social and political responses to it and the lack thereof for queer people and our communities. Queer vulnerability was not a political or institutional priority before the pandemic and has not become one since the pandemic's initiation. Even as queer scholars and health researchers noted the parallels between the COVID-19 pandemic and the AIDS crisis, and wondered how to reconcile risk management and social distancing with queer community, queer sexuality, and queer freedom. J. Blake Scott's call to consider queer promiscuity in a time of pandemic as a means of survival and organizing, rather than as a risky behavior, offers one alternative to heteronormative, monogamy-oriented framings of safety and responsibility, and invites us to think about how corona queering, what Scott defines as proliferating and promiscuous queer forms of how to help one another survive, can be a source of community strength rather than individual risk. For myself and my team, our study of queer people's experiences of COVID in the Greater Toronto Area became not only a means of attempting to bring to light the impact of cis heteronormative public health policy on queer communities and honor their work of corona queering, but our project and team itself became a critical form of corona queering for ourselves in creating a virtual space for queer intimacy and community. Our team of undergraduates and graduate students, led and trained by myself, my co-investigator Jessica Fields, and by James Gibb, first recruited queer participants from the Greater Toronto Area for a study of mental health, community supports, and pandemic experience. Out of the original 484 survey respondents, we also conducted semi-structured qualitative interviews with 44. Although interview is maybe a more formal word for what many participants described as feeling a bit more like therapy. We recruited them with an eye towards hearing from older participants, racialized and Indigenous people, and trans and non-binary people. And the descriptors I offer today reflect the language participants use to describe themselves. Those interviews, which were all conducted over Zoom, are my focus today. So I'll be sharing just a little bit of our emerging analysis, and this presentation draws particularly from my years of thinking and writing with two members of the Queer COVID team, my co-investigator, Jessica Fields, and Laura Beach, our project manager and qualitative team member. Unlike the United States and most other Canadian provinces, Ontario was under fairly strict stay-at-home orders for most of 2020 and 2021. In fact, we were the longest period of lockdowns outside of Asia. We conducted our interviews from May 2nd to June 17th of 2021, a period in which Toronto was at the tail end of its third largest wave to date at that point of COVID infections, and at which point most people had been working and living from home for a year. Ontario was in phase 2 of vaccine rollouts, where younger, so-called lower risk people would be eligible. On the day of the project's first interviews, just over 1 million people had received their first dose and about 95,000 people their second dose. By the last day of our interviews, over 2 million people, or 2/3 the population of Toronto, had received their first dose. As the vaccines continued to roll out, Toronto continued to contend with stay-at-home orders. When our interviews began, Ontario was in its third emergency and stay-at-home order. This order required that those not deemed essential workers must remain at home, save for essential purposes, which included grocery shopping, medication pickups at pharmacies, essential healthcare, outdoor exercise, or work that had special permissions to not be working remotely. Schools and childcare, however, remained open during this particular lockdown. The months in which we conducted these interviews were marked by a careful, cautious hope. Hope that an expansive enough vaccination campaign and careful provincial adherence to social distancing, to the request that we all stay home, was an investment that would pay off in widespread immunity and a reduction or even an elimination of COVID cases. Corona queering was not even a faint presence in public communications as COVID cases first began to emerge in North America, and public health authorities asserted that survival depended on all of us staying home. Home social distancing and isolation became the primary public health and government strategies of disease mitigation and control in Canada. Though critical in the initial months of the pandemic, these strategies revealed themselves to be, at best, insufficient solo approaches to COVID-19 management, as clinical and epidemiological knowledge of the disease and its vectors of transmission expanded. Despite confirmation that the virus is aerosolized and small enough to hang in the air for hours, the Canadian government has not required businesses or public infrastructure to overhaul or install air filtration systems. Masking indoors, including within schools, is no longer mandatory. Even the relatively simple and technologically uncomplicated collective measures to reduce airborne transmission utilized during the 1918 flu pandemic, for example, moving school instruction and social gatherings outdoors, installing large windows that could be opened in institutions such as hospitals and schools, and maintaining masking laws have not been instituted to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. In the absence of these collective structural and infrastructural mitigations, people, individuals, have been required to sacrifice crucial elements of our lives in order to individually mediate our own and others' risk of infection. Friendships, hobbies, social gatherings, extended family interactions, rites of passage, human contact outside the home, dating, and having sex outside of monogamous partnerships were largely set aside. Care labor overwhelmingly fell upon women in the absence of state and municipal services, while activities related to profit generation for employers continued with few pauses. That so much was demanded of people instead of cutting into the record corporate profits generated during and by the pandemic is only the latest intensification of the long-term neoliberal project of shifting social and economic responsibility for collective well-being onto private hospitals and away from governmental authorities and corporations. As Dugan and Kim have observed, in the absence of a functioning welfare state, the pressures towards and financial importance of the nuclear family unit becomes ever more desperate. And for many, biological cohabitating family is the one remaining resource they can access in times of disaster and the quotidian crises of late-stage capitalism. Halberstam's observation that the deployment of the concept of family, whether in hetero or homo context, almost always introduces normative understandings of time and transmission, is fundamental to our consideration of the impact of stay-at-home orders and the financial, social, and political pressures to revert to prioritizing the nuclear family unit during the pandemic. In public health orders, home and the implied nuclear family unit residing within that home emerge as a particular set of assumed ideals, that the nuclear family unit is straight, white, monogamous, exercises joyful and competent parenting, is safe, well, and uncomplicated. But like all hegemonic ideals, home was always complicated with taken for granted untruths. The assumption that everyone has a home, that homes have enough space and resources within them to meet our needs, that homes are filled with the people most important to us, that homes are safer than what lies beyond the front door. Many people, particularly queer people, have only precarious access to the support networks offered in our families of origin and build relationships that exceed the cis heteronormative bounds of home. We find home in polyamorous relationships, in fictive kinships, and in maid families. The pressure and requirement to pause or abandon these fundamental pieces of self and community in the context of ongoing governmental and corporate abandonment of communities points to the heteronormativity of public health policy embedded in the fabric of pandemic response, and introduced yet another disciplining apparatus of individualization of collective risk. Once again, queer people grappled with the pressure to negate critical aspects of self and community in order to ensure financial and health security. Today, I'd like to share with you some of the words of our interlocutors about the impacts of the pandemic and the effects of this kind of societal retreat into individualized, largely cis heteronormative roles and spaces on their mental health, sense of well-being, and sense of self. Our participants emphasized an awareness and a concern that rates of mental health issues and suicidality were already higher within the queer community prior to the pandemic. Additionally, feelings of vulnerability and isolation were further compounded by the closure of queer community spaces. Participants who were forced to move back in with unsupportive families of origin also struggled with re-traumatization and the foreclosure of queer identity expression within the home, while some, especially younger queer participants in safer housing situations, found that the pandemic created the conditions for freer gender experimentation and expression. George, a transgender man of mixed ethnicity, emphasized the exceptionally high rate of suicide in the trans community. He drew connections between suicidality and the closure of queer spaces, which he described as shrinking communities. According to George, the sudden lack of space for community connection within Toronto opened up a new realm of uncertainty. In addition to the threat of no longer having access to queer public spaces, George also described the threat of not knowing whether fellow members of the trans community were alive and well. Pre-pandemic, George could rely on specific spaces and events for connection and reassurance. With COVID-19 public health measures in the province, this certainty vanished. As George said, "At least we'll see them at the Meal Trans." Well, guess what? Meal Trans is closed, honey. So who knows if they made it? I'm still looking for some people. I don't know if she's made it. That's the scary thing. It's the not knowing. But this is the impact of the pandemic because all the places are closed that we used to go to. These observations and fears about the shrinking and loss of queer public space and services were echoed by so many of our participants, who consistently described the consequences of losing access to the city in which they'd made a home. They worried that the safety they sought through social distancing and staying at home would in turn imperil their communities. Even as many participants, particularly those who identify as women, femme, or trans, emphasized that the downtown core neighborhood, called colloquially the gayborhood or the village, is not a queer space that welcomes everyone or had even welcomed the participant in the past, but they still expressed fear that queer spaces and businesses in the village would not be able to survive the extended absence of customers. Miguel, a 21-year-old gay Latin American man, explained, the impact of the store closures or the fear of the small businesses, like the rallying around the Glad Day bookstores, or like the loss of places like Cruise or Buddies and Bad Times and all those places, like that changes so much. I think it's just how those places are more than just like the Google Maps identifier of bar. They mean so much more to us. I remember the weekend before the pandemic was declared a pandemic. I was at Cruise and Tangos, and there's a great picture of a friend of mine and me there dancing. And every couple of months, me and my friends send each other that picture. I'm just like, remember the last great night we had before the world went to shit? And that's what that means. It's not just a bar, like it wasn't. So I think that's also been an impact on how much the little amount of space we have, of how much the little amount of space we have and how important those spaces are feels like. If Glad Day were to close, if Cruise and Tangos got taken down, if, as we've lost a couple of places already, what does that impact mean? Raphael echoed these fears. He predicted Cruise and Tangos is probably going to be gone once this is finished. And it's a very important place because a lot of people rely on that place to feel safe. To go to the drag shows, it is actually one of the places that are very inclusive with everyone, and it should be important to keep a place like that, because it doesn't matter if you arrive wearing a dress or being very manly. The concept of man is relative. Everyone is welcome there. Participants' acknowledgement of the imperfectness of the village as a utopian queer space rested without tension alongside their fears that even these spaces, increasingly rainbow-washed, white, and gentrifying though they may be, might not be waiting for them on the other side of the pandemic. Muñoz's framing of queerness as a horizon of possibility speaks to the complementarity of hope for the potentiality of queer space against an acknowledgement of their imperfections and concerns for their longevity. The implicit fear of several participants, particularly those who do not identify as gay cisgender men, seem to be, if even this type of queer space cannot survive, how can the types of spaces that I need to truly feel welcome be sustained? In other words, how can we continue to strive for a radical queer vision if we cannot even maintain what we've achieved so far? In addition to the closure of community spaces, Anais, a Black agender person in her mid-20s who uses she, her pronouns, described the impact of being forced to isolate at home with immediate family who were intensely religious and homophobic. Anais outlined the various ways that her family attempted to force her into being cisgender and heterosexual. In addition to confiscating jewelry and destroying property, family members would try to manipulate Anais's sexuality by encouraging attraction to men. Anais drew a parallel between her experience and the experiences of women in domestic violence households who are forced to isolate with their abusers. As she described, I noticed on the news, they're mostly focusing on women's experiences in the pandemic, and they're calling it a shadow pandemic or a second pandemic, because they're realizing that women in emotionally and physically abusive relationships are now isolating 24/7 with their batterers. There is no escape. That same dynamic is being replicated with LGBT youth and LGBT young adults, isolating with homophobic, queerphobic, sometimes super religious relatives, in which the only escape you had pre-pandemic was going to work, was going to school, was being a member of the school's gay-straight alliance or different campus clubs and associations. You do not have that escape anymore. Unable to escape, isolated from queer community, and lacking adequate resources, Anais described this experience as both a form of what she termed compounded isolation and trauma with emotional, psychological, and religious dimensions. At the time of our interview, more than 15 months into the pandemic, Anais continued to struggle with what she referred to as becoming her own person, while living with family who she classified as the source of her trauma. Other participants echoed this experience, particularly young queer folks who found themselves forced to move back in with their families of origin due to the closures of university housing or pandemic unemployment. Era, a 19-year-old non-binary trans femme, described their frustrations and the hurt they felt over their parents' refusal to acknowledge or respect their gender identity. Era explained, "They say they support me, but they really don't, because as a trans person, they don't respect my chosen name or preferred name, pronouns, etc., etc. I'd say, I guess the best way I could describe their attitude towards me is like tolerant." The experiences of Era and Anais are important reminders that for many queer people, especially those who are financially precarious or young, public health policies requiring retreat into the home without sufficient social supports to allow people to live independently from biological family are policies of abandonment. When we received our project's funding and began to more deeply plan both the data collection and our research assistance training, Jessica, James, and myself were especially compelled by our intuition that there were many members of our community in similar positions to Anais and Era, and our knowledge that existing mental health services and public health policy were not accounting for the increased needs of our most vulnerable. But we were equally certain that our communities were also adapting, tinkering, experimenting, and creating new ways of being queer, that queerness could surely be spreading at home, in virtual spaces, in smaller but no less important circles of queer sociality. And we wanted to be sure to hold space for queer joy. As we found, for some queer folks, the call to stay home meant relief from the everyday violence of public life, including racialized and colonial violence against trans, Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. In Toronto, where in 2022, the Toronto Police Service released data proving a long suspected institutional pattern of extreme targeting of Black, Indigenous, and Brown residents, where the police declined to investigate the murders of queer brown men committed by serial killer Bruce McArthur for decades, and where the city has waged a profoundly violent and expensive war on primarily Indigenous and Brown unhoused people throughout the pandemic, queer public life is not equally accessible to all members of the community and is shaped by the intersecting oppressions of misogynoir, transmisogyny, and white supremacy. Some participants found that in withdrawing from public spaces, they were able to carefully cultivate the contact they had with others, limiting their exposure to racism, transphobia, and homophobia, while deepening their connections to communities that honored their identities, and taking a well-needed break from the stress of discrimination and harassment. While the public seemed to pose a barrier to many people's sense of self and self within community, for some participants, the social isolation and shift to online social community seems to have created the conditions of possibility to explore the parts of themselves that were previously inaccessible due to the foreground distractions of pre-pandemic life. As Vaughn, a 21-year-old lesbian Filipina Canadian, newly identifying as non-binary, explained, they, them, that probably started like 4 months back when I really had time to go there. And in general, to think about what that even means to me. So definitely being alone and just having time to think to myself with a full head of sleep. But I guess being isolated has really made me reevaluate what gender means to me and what pronouns feel comfortable. I feel like dress is also a big part in there are a lot of things I want to wear, but I also don't want to wear them outside because I don't want to feel uncomfortable or be yelled at. So like when I'm just dressing up at home or I'm just dressing up for a walk outside my home, I feel comfortable doing that. So yeah, I'm comfortable in the sense of like, I have the people that I talk to or my bubble, and they respect the pronouns that I like. And obviously I feel comfortable being queer around them. And then I can also dress however I want because it's like, I feel safe to do that now. This space of queer possibility, what we might think of as a period of queer incubation before bursting back into the world, was shared by other participants who experienced themselves in a new light and witnessed others considering new gender and sexual selves. As Raul, a gay Latin American immigrant in his late 20s, similarly explained, I've been seeing a lot of my queer friends just become more queer and more gay, and just everyone's been opening up a lot more about their sexualities and their sexual identities, which is such a great conversation. And they really inspired me to start looking at how I look at myself. Raul explained that he attributed the gender and sexual shifts not to a trauma of being queer, but rather to a sense of excitement and possibility, a queer horizon of joy and experimentation. The sense of possibility and dynamism fosters thinking that recalls a sense of queerness, transgression, and play that seems to belong to the before COVID times, without denying the reality or existence of the pandemic. Much has changed since spring and summer of 2021, when the words I've shared with you were last spoken. And our governments have rushed to negate and deny the persistence of this pandemic, its effects, and the grief at what and who we've lost to it continue unabated and without public mechanism for mourning. Queer lives are among those lost, and many of us raise children, build families and businesses, and form communities. But we also live outside these normative structures of home. As Raul expressed, some people were able to use this pandemic time to become more queer and more gay. And a number of younger participants have found this time to be a period of transformation in their gender identities, which is surely a form of finding home. Just as the push to return to normal marks an erasure not only of the still unfolding pandemic, but also of the many ways that normal was never acceptable or survivable for so many people, so too does that push to return to normal also obscure that normal was impossible and undesirable for many queer, neurodivergent, disabled, Indigenous, Black, and Brown people. Listening with a queer ear illuminates resilience and creativity as people find ways to live in social rupture and abandonment without totally giving over of themselves. Such listening also highlights how for many, the ability to embody one's most desirable present and future selves is not supported when heteronormative framings of home as a refuge are privileged. In our current era of persecution of queer people and communities, I'm reminded of the beautiful threat that queerness poses to the violent institutions of our society. For when we explore and experiment within our own queerness, we're also challenging the world that is, and demanding that it shift to become a place that we can claim as our home too. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you so much to everybody, all of the presenters. This was really totally fascinating and wonderful. Really all such great talks, giving us so much food for thought. So I know that we have questions coming in. So, and we have definitely time for Q&A. So that will be really, I'm sure, very interesting and enlightening. While I'm waiting for some questions to come in, I have a kind of question for everybody. I hope I can make it coherent. And it's sort of in a way reflecting on the topic as a whole. In a way, I think very much inspired by, I think, Ava's really important provocations about even thinking about the very language in a way of the symposium, but also more broadly, even just thinking about, again, the very relationship between queer and pandemics and all the multifaceted ways that that happens. So I think, Ava, you made this fascinating observation that saying sort of that there's a kind of pandemic thinking in even saying queering pandemics, which I think is fascinating. And I would love to hear you say more about that. And I'm wondering if you think that that's necessarily problematic. It seems as if it would be problematic to have a pandemic thinking to saying queering pandemics, that if that's a pandemic thinking. Yet at the same time, I also thought that it was very interesting that, for example, in Joe's talk, there was a way in which, Joe, for example, you talked about that there's a way in which thinking about queerness as contagious can be a good thing, right? And I feel like there was a way also, Sarah, in your talk that you also sort of suggested, right? You had that slide that said, that talked about the contagious freedom of queerness, so that a kind of thinking, a kind of pandemic thinking contagiousness maybe could be a good thing. And Marlon, I don't think you necessarily address this perhaps as explicitly as the others, but by my read, and of course, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, it seemed like maybe you were a little bit on both sides of that, which of course makes perfect sense given that your topic was irony, right? That you looked in a way at how there was a kind of these friendships. You very much, again, emphasize the kind of contagiousness of friendships and the importance of friendships and this kind of spreadable love. But you also talked about feelings of isolation through pandemic. So it seemed as if you looked at the kind of, again, ironies of that. So again, this is sort of a somewhat vague question, but, a question to all of you about, is there a way in which we ourselves are falling into pandemic ways of thinking, contagion ways of thinking? Is that necessarily a problem? Are there also potentials in that? I would just love to hear what any and or all of you have to think about that. And while you're mulling that over, again, I do want to invite the audience to please send in questions for us. So anyone who wants to start?
Yes, I think the way you frame the question is really, really interesting, and I think captures the full dimensionality of all of the panelists in terms of the perspectives on how to think about not only the experience of pandemics, the experience of COVID-19, HIV/AIDS, monkeypox, and other crises that whereby queer people, and particularly for my purposes, queer people of color, and I'm using queer capaciously, are scapegoated. And our experiences have the outcome of being both scapegoated and targeted. And ultimately, it's a distraction from the failures. It's a distraction from the other underpinning pandemics of what Eva eloquently talked about: transmisogyny, homophobia, structural homophobia, transmisogyny, and socioeconomic deprivation, political silencing, and political dispossession, the dispossession of families and communities of origin. It is a huge scapegoat and a distraction that, to Ava's point, if we follow the distraction and look the wrong way, then we're looking away from the real material realities, which all of the panelists spoke to, that are underpinning the structural vulnerabilities that are underpinning the discourse and the approaches to pandemics. So, and the last thing I want to say is that it is a cruel irony that the very thing that I just described, all of that trash that I just described, actually for some become an opportunity for developing and forging deeper, long-term, sustainable relationships with community. And I'm in a place right now that I'm thinking that community is what we got. Community is where it's at, because if we are looking for state recognition, if we're looking for us not to no longer be scapegoated, that's not going to happen. So our communities are where we find the mutual recognition, where we see each other, love each other, and engage one another as full persons and value one another. That's where I think it's at. But that's me working out this cruel irony, because it is cruel. I mean, the COVID was fucked up. That was some fucked up shit. It was horrible. But out of it, there are things that I learned, there are connections that I made, and I feel like I became a different person in some ways, not totally, for the better.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, Marlon. I think that, and this question's fantastic. Thank you so much, Lynn. And I loved all the panels. They helped me think in more dynamic ways about the questions that I'm caught up in. And I think that is what I wanted to say, is that in the midst of pandemics, we race because we have to. We race to find quick answers to badly crafted questions because pandemics are states of emergency. And sometimes those badly answered questions stick and they stay and they confuse our thinking. And I think that that's my caution, or at least one of my cautions, is that even when we think we know what a pandemic is or exactly what constitutes AIDS, for instance, we may be wrong. And how do we ask that question when we make it a historical archive? When we say AIDS is something in the past, it becomes very difficult for us to understand how AIDS is still with us and how AIDS, disturbingly for me, seemed to be responded to through COVID, not just its structural racism, but also it's as if the ways in which we imagined distance, the socially distant, there are ways in which the very logic of the pains many of us experienced with HIV/AIDS was materialized in the ways in which we were meant to socially respond to each other, sexually, physically, materially. And it was very reactivating of old trauma, actually. And I think that those are some of the questions that I want us to be careful to not think we already know. So I guess that's really what I wanted to say. I'll stop there.
Ava, your talk was so provocative to me in the work that I do, looking both at the material meaning of pathogens. I wouldn't say AIDS, but HIV. If one looks at the meaning of HIV, it has shifted over the decades. HIV does not mean what it did in 1992 for many people, at least, and yet AIDS has both a cultural and social meaning in addition to the biological and biomedical one. I was really moved by your ending, invoking us to think about something more radical than queer, indeed more radical than any of the identifications that currently exist, and the tension between that and my work, where if I go tell a group of scientists that I want you to include material analyses of colonialism and post-colonialism in how you publish your scientific findings, that is already almost so radical that it feels impossible in my lifetime. And yet, as though it's something we must demand because it's required, I think it's not coincidental that we all touched on lockdown. That was not a part of the prompt to touch on queerness in 2020 and experiences of lockdown, both the pain and trauma and the opportunity for ruptures with normal capitalism routines of life, periods of self-reflection, periods of different community making, maybe remote community making, maybe, I found my social life pared way down, whereas I used to have to go out every weekend. I had to ask myself, who are the 4 people that I'm going to experience risk with in our pod, right? It is a complete restructuring of life and was a huge opportunity. So I'm curious of everyone's thoughts about why this was so present in all of our talks. And then Ava, in your talk as well, I do a lot of my work as a biologist who's also a writer, is about removing metaphors of war from biomedical language. So indeed, trying to arrest language that calls queerness a contagion, or that wants us to fight a war against COVID-19, that creates violent language where our bodies and immune systems are interacting with the world, to try to think about maybe not even just metaphor-free language, but language that builds metaphors of care into how our bodies interact with the world. And I feel like you were almost inverting that, sort of ironically playing with languages of pandemics and contagions for talking about structural violence. And that it pushed on my buttons in a way, because normally that would drive me crazy. But I think the way that you do it actually shows the ways in which those things are as violent as pandemics, or indeed are a part of the violence of pandemics, right? Because it is not by mistake that the same people harmed by AIDS are the same people harmed by COVID, are the same people harmed by Mpox. And indeed, the people who have died globally of Mpox are almost all experiencing not HIV, but untreated HIV and AIDS, right? So I just was so enthralled by your use of that, and I'm going to be thinking about it for a long time.
Yeah. So I don't know if Sarah, you also wanted to respond to my question about the pitfalls, but also the possibilities of even thinking about queerness as contagion. And then I also, Ava, wanted to give you, if you wanted, you don't have to, a chance to respond again back to what Joe just said. So if would either of you like to take that opportunity?
Ava, why don't you go ahead?
You go ahead, Sarah. Do you want to?
Well, this may be a left turn, but I think that during Joe's talk in particular about the joy of queerness, and rather than the regret of being queer, really spoke to me, and I was giving you snaps at those points. But at least I actually had not initially written this talk with kind of the plays on the language of incubation and contagion, and only added that this morning and thinking this might be fun to kind of subvert, or see if it's possible to subvert and play around with. But really out of a sense of well, if queerness is contagious, if people are seeing other people being queer or coming into proximity with queerness and thinking that seems like something they might like to choose to try, then what's wrong with that? Like, what could be more beautiful than a spreading queerness of a queerness that has the opportunity to spread because it appeals, and people who are not already within a queer community can see joy in it and can see it as aspirational in some sense. So I'll leave you to respond to Joe, but that was just some some play that I wanted to try in my presentation.
Ava, I don't know if you want, you don't need to respond, but if you would like to.
I'll just say I have to think about what you wrote, Joe. I mean, what you said, rather. Sorry, it's 10 o'clock here. My brain, after the week of teaching, it's a little dim, so I apologize. I have to think about that more. I do absolutely believe, and I think Marlon was also elaborating this point, is that HIV isn't simply a virus, that often or monkeypox is not simply a virus, or COVID was not simply a virus, and that there's a way in which the medicalized and scientific discourse, which I'm quite interested in those histories, limits how we understand the overwhelming violence of these pandemics and the many ways in which they still show up. I mean, that part of my point about the gerund querying is a critique that I make in the transgender studies piece about where did transgendering come from, which it really comes from queer theory. And queer theory is often framed as happening as an effect of the AIDS pandemic. How did lesbians and gay men come together when lesbian and gay studies was sort of fragmented and queer theory emerges, or at least that's one of the ways in which we theorize or historicize the field. And so I do want us to, if we're going to use this language, to not make it directional toward simply queer people, but actually to aim it at times to the structures that are working seemingly every day to kill us. So that for me is important. I think the other thing I would just want to say about Marlon, I mean, I loved that you evoked sexuality, sex in the scene of COVID. And I think that one of the things I worry about, and that's part of the last part of the paper, is what happens to sexuality, even in terms of identity, but what happens to sexuality in terms of pandemics? How does it discipline our, even to ourselves, overwhelming, unbearable, compulsions to experience the body and other bodies in ways that are difficult to represent even to ourselves. And I wondered if you could talk more about, Marlon, about, you wanting to invoke sexuality in the context of COVID, which was so much about the unbearability of isolation.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ava. And again, I want to reiterate, thank you so much for joining us with the time difference. And it's amazing. And you are anything but dim. We should all be so lucky to be, at our brightest, what you consider dim. Marlon, that would be wonderful if you could respond to what Ava just asked. And then I'm happy that we have also been getting some questions from the audience. So Marlon, why don't you answer, and then I'll start giving you all some of the questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Ava, for that really important question. And the reason why I bring that up and I evoke sexuality during this this moment, and I'm responding to both HIV, AIDS, and COVID-19, and also monkeypox, is that it's really important to me as a community, a queer community strategy, to constantly bring sex in the conversation when part of the role of the discourses that underpin pandemics, particularly when it's infectious disease, is meant to shut down. It's meant to both silence and delimit the possibilities of the experiences with the body. And I always want to capture something that you said, is that there are no easy answers, but we have to participate in the conversation about the body as a way to claim our bodies, reclaim our bodies and reclaim our sexualities, because structures that are designed to kill us are also designed to stop us from experiencing the humanity of pleasure, of bodily pleasures, right? And to regulate. And I mean, it's something that you talked about in your talk when you were speaking about erotophobia. And so it's important. And just a quick note to Joseph's point about, part of the important strategy, what we have to continue to do. And I'm an ethnographer that writes about health, and constantly bringing up colonialism, settler colonialism, structural racism and white supremacy, homophobia, transmisogyny, and ableist discourses that underpin or that permeate strategies for HIV prevention, but also erotophobia. And so it's important and I love what you're saying, it's important for you to continue to push in the spaces you move in, to continue to push and require that people attend to the materiality of pandemics, the materialities of the structures of health that are not designed and do not intend on protecting us. Not at all. And so we can't continue to have these discussions. I mean, I'm not here, I'm talking about in the public health space. We can't continue to have those discussions that pretend as though that it's just about the viral, the sort of the retrovirus, when we know it's not about a retrovirus only. We have to continue to put it in the context of materiality and structure.
Yeah.
Lynn, just before you go very, very quickly, I want to just again thank Marlon for bringing sex into the room, because one thing that we see again and again and again, even from within gay people, I'm saying gay here specifically, not queer people, they use pandemics to police others' pleasure, which is a goal that they have all the time. You saw it with HIV/AIDS, you saw it with COVID and the shaming of people who were having sex during lockdown and COVID. And my fucking God, during monkeypox, it was a fucking disaster. Blaming people for their own illness, evoking abstinence as a personal public solution. The strain of conservatism is coming from within the house. And it's been a decades-long sort of struggle, and it's one that we must continue.
Yeah. And of course, you see that over issues around reproductive justice as well. And yeah. All right. So we've gotten some questions from the audience. The first one, and I will just read them. Thank you for the thought-provoking session. Thank you, audience member. I struggle with the loss of community as discussed today. And yet the current attacks on the queer communities make me wonder about the dangers of identifiable public spaces that leave us open to attack. How do we square these two needs? Anyone who wants to jump in with that very tough question?
I mean, I can start just think about, it's something I think about a lot, that increased visibility is a part of the current gay and trans moral panic, I think. But one doesn't capitulate to fascists. on their grounds. Those spaces are worth protecting. It is a part of the way, and the good way that Sarah and I have tried to evoke, that queerness has become contagious, and that it's saving young people's lives. What I would have given at 12 to not just have thought of gayness or queerness as HIV death, but of a possibility of an otherwise life. And so it does put us at risk, but I think that it's a necessary risk that as Audre Lorde would evoke, what is the cost of silence? And many of us grew up in a time where there was that silence, there was that lack of public visibility, of not will and grace, but of an otherwise queerness. And I think it's worth digging in our toes and continuing to not be afraid of creating visible art, visible spaces, visible communities, because of the possibility that it makes for younger people and for one another.
Mm-hmm. If I could just add a little bit onto that as well. Something that became really clear in the queer COVID study is that there were very obvious divisions in who felt that they benefited from lockdown, from the ability or access to virtual queer spaces, which we might also think of as queer space that is less visible, invite only. You have to already be in community to find most of the time. And so who often seemed to struggle the most were older queer people who were used to having, a physical, the gay bar or the lesbian bookshop, or in Toronto, it's also the lesbian sex toy store, and places that for decades have been these real centers and linchpins for community. And when you take that away, it becomes so hard to start over, to figure out how to do it again. And that's not even getting, well, I was talking to people in their 70s, but also, of course, means, with the stripping away of wheel trans. So that's a meal service that prioritizes trans people of color and trans sex workers in Toronto. Without those kinds of spaces that are also services, because space is service for so much of us, you're cutting people off of what they need to live, like spiritually and as people, but also as bodies that need care. And so what we might also think about is, how do we and can we provide that kind of care outside of physical space? Is it possible? Is that maybe a new dimension of queer life, is thinking beyond the physical space? But I think maybe we're just not quite ready or able to abandon queer physical space without abandoning really vulnerable members of our communities.
And some of it is also, again, even trying to think very capaciously, but also critically about what's considered public space. Because some, for example, in your presentation, sir, where you talked about something like a bar, which in many ways is, of course, privatized space because it's, privately owned and part of a capitalist system, et cetera. But as your respondents indicated, it's not just a bar, right? And then there are things that are, again, in, social media, again, fully commodified, privatized space that are marked for us, oh, this is your public space. But as we see, those are disciplined in very particular ways. That doesn't mean that there are not really important possibilities there. And we see different communities trying to create their own possibilities. But I think we have to, try to think about how we make use, as a media studies scholar, is that, how we can create possibilities there instead of just taking for granted what counts as public, to try to, negotiate some of these tensions that the audience member, rightly points out are so complicated. Another question.
I want to add to that.
Yes, certainly.
There are models. First of all, as a Black gay man all my life, and I'm 54, I had a risk of community building has always been present for me. But as Joe suggests, the risk is worth it because the alternative is untenable. And because, as I talked about in my presentation, because my friends and community are my livelihood, I don't have an alternative, and I'm actually cool with that. Because my family and community of origin, have been trash most of my life. So the communities and families that I've built have been my livelihood. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that there are models. So I would look at the ballroom community, which I work on, and the ballroom community is a social configuration, but it's also a very transient in terms of its relationship to space. And during the pandemic, the ballroom community shifted to virtual, and now increasing, and they were holding virtual balls. I was actually conducting research with the ballroom community during the pandemic, and now they are shifting to back to a kind of a more hybrid model where you have in-person balls, but a lot of the community and the social configuration is operated virtually. And so part of that has been how ballroom communities have always had to respond, given the constant structural crises that its members are always situated within, right? And so they've had to be improvisational, they've had to be nimble and versatile, and really ingenious, which I argue that they, as a community, are. So we have models to look at for building community, reducing risk for violence, surveillance, infiltration, and eradication, and appropriation, although, there's that too. So there are models for doing this that I think that we can, again, look at and lean into.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Okay, next question from the audience that says, thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. Dr. Hayward, I'm really interested in your correction that there's no dysphoria without transmisogyny, which also means dysphoria is racialized, and that this is not solidarity thinking, this is reason. What do you see the gap between solidarity thinking and reason to be? How do you work with that gap politically, intellectually, and so on, especially in relation to these questions around state violence and movement building?
That's a very demanding question. I will try to answer pieces of that. I would say very simply that what I'm trying to say about trans misogyny is that it's a structure that all of us are immersed in, and it affects us all, that we are experiencing forms of trans misogyny, all of us in this panel, in this space, but that we think that that it's specific to trans women. Trans women have specific relationships to trans misogyny. But I would say what is trans misogyny, the way I'm thinking about it, needs to be thought as a structural force at work in the derangement of social life. That trans misogyny affects us. What we think of trans womanhood affects us all over the place, and often when there are no trans women in the room. So part of what I want to begin to think about is how we might understand it as a destructive social force that is affecting not just trans women, but many kinds of people. So that's one thing I'm thinking about. I also want to put pressure on dysphoria, that if we understand the legacies of modern gender categories like man and woman, male and female, as effects of colonial racism, as effects of empire, then we have to ask What is it when we want to be a woman? What is it when we want to be a man? Not just for trans people, but for everyone. What is at stake in that coherence, in that legibility? And for trans people, I want us to think about that, to layer in what is racist about dysphoria. It's a very difficult concept, but it is something I think is worth asking. And I don't mean this just for white trans women or white trans men, but how does dysphoria carry the legacies of racial imaginary into sex gender structures? So I guess that answers, I hope, what I mean by solidarity and reason is that I'm not advocating for tolerance. I'm not advocating for be tolerant to trans women, recognize the violence they experience. You should. But I'm also saying that violence is disfiguring our social world. We are living in the derangement of transmisogyny everywhere. And that's what I mean by it's not solidarity thinking, but it's reason. So we need to start tracking how transmisogyny affects spaces all over, affects bathrooms, affects policy, affects gay and lesbian spaces, affects all kinds of spaces, I would argue.
Yeah.
Can I jump on that as well? Because that line I think is so important, because people in systems of power, when they're liberal, it's a very patronizing, oh, I'm listening, I'm understanding. And I think about this a lot in terms of white supremacy's impact on white people, and our engagement with it, and cis people's relationship to trans identity, gender, and their engagement with it. Gender norms hurt cis people. White supremacy hurts white people, and it's everywhere, including in rooms with just white people. And I think that if, and it's whiteness isn't categorized as a race, cisgender isn't categorized as a gender. And I think you're doing the work of saying, actually, that's not logical. And, white people love to be the kings of logical, right? Everything is reason. We did the fucking Enlightenment, like at reason wins the day. Well, I'm sorry. My friend Chanda Prescott-Weinstein calls this white empiricism. If you applied that same standard to your assumptions, the assumptions of whiteness, the assumptions of cisness, you fail. And what does it mean that you fail at your own need for empiricism when it is your own myth making that you're examining? And I think that I think is taking this conversation to a radicalism that's beyond queerness, that it's not just about queer spaces. In a way, the right wing has it right. We are trying to destroy the family because the family fucking sucks. It is a site of violence and of ownership. And it just fucking sucks a lot of the time for a lot of people, not just queer people. So, I think your language is very carefully poking at these patronizing assumptions that people in the majoritarian have when they're being good liberal allies toward people who are othered in whatever way.
Okay, our next question, which I think will probably be our last question from the audience. Thank you to everyone for super fascinating and thoughtful presentations. I'm wondering if any or all of you would be willing to speak about method. Of course, Joseph got at this with his call for queer science, as did Ava with her reflections on transgender studies. But I would love to hear more. I would love to hear more about how you negotiate methodologically or with disciplinary formations like ethnography, ecology, critical theory, etc. Thanks. And I appreciate that question from the audience, because I do think that this was, in my view, a wonderful opportunity to really have an interdisciplinary, a truly transdisciplinary conversation across people from science studies, anthropology, queer theory, trans studies, performance studies, art. I mean, we brought together lots of things in a way that I think was incredibly productive, but I know that can also be challenging. So again, I think it's a great question from the audience. I don't, whoever wants to jump in, if anybody wants to reflect on that.
Definitely, that is a wonderful question. I'll start by saying that I am an ethnographer, but not an anthropological ethnographer, nor am I a sociological ethnographer, although I've had coursework in sociology and ethnography. I am a critical performance ethnographer. I'm trained in Black studies and women, gender, and sexuality studies. And so I say that because I focus on the body, embodied knowledge, and community practices, and the way that everyday communities who are impacted by structures of violence, of state violence and non-state actor violence, I reflect with them to create narratives about our experiences. Mm-hmm. And I focus on the ways in which the body and other community practices, like the reconstitution of family formations, because I agree with Joseph, families are often trash. I observe and participate in, and I witness, that's the word I was looking for. I witness the way that family formations and community formations are rebuilt, are reconstituted, and both critique normative family formations and gender and sexual norms and categories and practices for something new. I document and witness and work with how Black LGBTQIAI+ communities create spaces for sex, create spaces for self-affirmation, for self-value and mutual recognition, despite all of the violent conditions under which they have to negotiate and live often. And I use Black queer and feminist theories, like trans theories, and knowledge and literature to analyze and be in conversation with what these communities do in the everyday.
I can, because this is something that for the Queer COVID Project was a constant negotiation from the beginning. I'm a medical anthropologist, a cultural medical anthropologist. I don't do stats. I'm not really interested in numbers. But James Gibb, my organizer of he would agree that numbers are extremely gay, but but I don't see it. James is a biological anthropologist, so all about the biomarkers and the stats. And Jessica Fields is an absolutely brilliant sociologist. And so the three of us together really had to sit down and think about, how do we make this work? And I, as a medical anthropologist, I've been working for my own personal work. I've been working with the same communities, the same midwives for about 15 years now. Like, they're my chosen family, many of them. I'm a birth worker too. So there's a lot of emplacement that was not possible in a project initiated during lockdown, where we had to think about, we can't be with people, we can't see where they live, we can't attend events with them, we can't even, touch their hand while we're hearing their stories. And I love, Marlon, your word witnessing, because that's what it really felt like for the interviews, is that for some people, we were the first sort of human contact that they'd had in a long time. An hour to a 90-minute conversation about their experience and their feelings and what they were witnessing was the most, space that anyone had held for them in a long time. was immensely powerful for us too, as the interviewers, like incredibly important to have. And a like through line of my conversations with Jessica and James and our planning and how we trained the RAs was, what about this is queer? How do we hold space for queer methodology and queer interaction under the constraint of Zoom? And I think we achieved it in some sense, in part because it was reciprocal. We found community in interviews, which you're probably not supposed to do, but who can help it under those conditions? So I guess I would say the methods for what I presented were messy and multimodal and transdisciplinary in pretty much every way you can imagine, and human. And I think we've been slow to publish and slow to get the writing out, which I have a lot of feelings about. But I think we all needed the project at that point in the pandemic, and we needed each other, and we also needed our interlocutors.
Yeah.
I know we're close to time, but I have a very quick, I think I'm very much in agreement with Sarah and Marlon. My methods are a fucking mess. I'm trained to troubleshoot PCRs. Like, that's what my training is. And yet, as someone who did literature at the undergraduate level, I've always carried on multiple methodologies, modes of inquiry, because I think any one mode of inquiry is inherently insufficient. And so promiscuity, it's like you have a bunch of problems in life, and each problem might ask for a different set of methodologies, and no one person can be good at all methodologies. And so you have to be promiscuous and collaborative. You have to learn from people, which is why I like these panels so much, because I get to learn from such incredible people and with people. And that all my work with the Congo is with a queer Congolese person. Just from our friendship, I was telling him about molecular epidemiology, he was telling me about Congolese history, and now we're writing a book where either of us would be insufficient with our single methodology to tell what I think are perfectly overlapping stories. And he learned from me some things about the way the science was done, and I've learned so much from him. Everything about social and political history in the Congo is his work, right? So promiscuity and collaboration, man, that's the way forward.
And we are close to time, but Ava, did you want to say anything briefly to that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I similarly have, I think promiscuous is a good word for my own habits, intellectual habits. And I would say that there's some part of me that, and maybe this goes back to Marlon's work on the body, there's something about sensuality, that there is a way in which I, both as a teacher, but also as a thinker, I try to have a feel for the work, whether it's a sentence or a word, that there's something very formalist for me and sensualist about thinking. And so that's always the starting place from which I begin my projects. Now, there's a wonderful book by Evelyn Fox Keller, which you might know, Joseph, A Feeling for the Organism, about Barbara McClintock, who discovered genetics, who gave us insights into particular kinds of genetic processes, and yes, maize. And the title of the book is Feeling for the Organism. And I often think about a kind of feeling for a sentence, a feeling for argumentation, that's where I start. So it requires promiscuity at its heart.
Well, thank you all so much. I one of the things I work on is media studies and engaging with the world via screens. And so it's just so wonderful that we were able to engage with one another via this screen. It was wonderful to have our community this way. I think that these talks were all so enormously productive, so enormously thought-provoking. Thank you all so much. It was just fantastic. Thank you to the Pembroke, all our co-sponsors. Thank you to the audience. Again, thank you so much to our speakers. And I would just say to people, keep, looking out on the Pembroke website for upcoming events. And again, terrific. Thanks so much. And, good evening to everybody. Bye.